Today's conversation is all about circular economy, and I'm joined by Emma Burlow, the Director and Head of Circular Economy at Resource Futures, an organisation that works with the likes of Waitrose and others. So welcome, Emma.
Thanks very much. Morning.
So can you describe what you mean by circular economy?
Well, it's a term that's been evolving over sort of 20, 30 years really, and it does capture a really broad church, if you like, and it means a lot of things to different people. But for me, really, it's about having a more resource aware approach to life and to business specifically. So where we have essentially a linear world at the moment, where we take resources, we make product and we dispose of them. Our waste is treated as a waste. A circular economy is where those resources are taken, but they are valued as such through their whole life, so the whole use phase. So they'll be used but not disposed. They'll be reused or recycled and kept in play, if you like. It is a more natural way of managing our resources. Its origins are taken from some natural cycles and biomimicry, but in today's business world, it tends to relate more to things like repair, reuse, remanufacture, and then other business models like leasing, even the sharing economy, are all part of the circular economy.
There's something that sounds really, really nice about this. I mean, obviously I'm getting more and more into this as more and more people start talking about it, but it feels like there's sort of almost like an inherent respect over things, not just respect over people, but respect over the resources that you're talking about here. It's almost like nothing is actually disposable. And that things have a real kind of lifetime value for the lifetime that they can be things or entities or widget or kind of raw materials. Because if this thing is circular, there's a real respect going on.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. I mean, the reason we ended up with a linear economy and not a circular economy, we could have gone a different way. Because before the linear economy, things were, resources were used much more in a circular fashion. So, I often talk about repair is not a new thing. Both of the world wars that are, so highly talked about were built on remanufacture and repair and make, do, amend and all that sort of thing. So the linear economy really, really picked up post-war, where there was a strong feeling of, having to get the economy restarted. A free world is a world where you can consume whatever you want. And also at the time, supply chains were changing so rapidly and costs were coming down so rapidly. So really the kind of global economy almost had a choice then, and it went for the linear option. And there are loads of reasons why. Because it suited and materials were in kind of apparently inexhaustible supply, and it wasn't really until probably the 70s or 80s people started saying, well, what if this stuff runs out? Is that a problem? Is resource scarcity a problem? By which point the kind of juggernaut got going with just in time and even lean manufacturing, which is a great thing, brilliant thing, but it was all about making things quicker, more efficiently, but it still didn't think about getting those products back. It still assumed that they had a single life and that they would be disposed of. So yeah, there was no respect really for those things, and the planet as we are learning now. But in their defence, in the defence of those economists or those people that put those models into place, it was a different time and we didn't have the information that we have now about the damage that was being done. So some of it's been, awareness that has caused this, increase in data around climate change, around deforestation. So I think that's caused the respect. It's a typical thing. Humans need to see it to really bother about it. And now we can get cameras into rainforests, or we can get cameras into the ocean, and we can see the damage we're doing, I think that's what's really made the difference in the last decade. The respect definitely has changed.
So that's an interesting one with the kind of the reporting of it, and I think certainly we've seen over probably the last, well, an increasing amount over the last sort of 12 months in terms of, you know, you need to take this seriously, business owner, decision maker, board of directors, you know, you have to take this seriously. And, you know, things like Mark Carney coming out with the, you know, you're going to be out of business shortly if you're not taking this thing seriously. You know, there's obviously a lot of kind of pressure on sort of decision makers in business on doing this. Are you seeing any changes now? Obviously, we're in a very different, well, unique sort of multi-generational situation where, you know, nobody really who's alive today has kind of seen or been through this kind of a global pandemic before. So are you seeing anything sort of change in terms of the trends, the kind of tone of voice, people's interest in this kind of now versus maybe 6 months ago?
I have to say yes, and I think I am seeing a change. My kind of hesitancy, I suppose, or cynicism a little bit is that there's change and there's change. You know, there are businesses who clearly want the world to change, and they may have not been listened to, or they may have been laughed out of court, you know, 10 years ago. So, you know, you have your businesses like EcoVerb in 40 years, you know, working around circularity, Patagonia. Some of the big leaders are now on the global stage, you know, which is great. I think what you're seeing change is what I would say the response from mainstream businesses is changing. They're interested in it, but they may not quite know what to do about it. It's almost seen as another pressure, whereas I tend to see the whole circular economy as a huge opportunity. I don't operate in an area of challenge and great kind of barrier, although I get asked to speak about it all the time. What are the main barriers to the circular economy? Oh my God, I don't see any. The only barriers I see is to not doing it. The risk is not doing it. So it's about, you know, it's a bit of a sea change for a lot of people. And when you consider if you're going to change your business, you're potentially pushing against kind of 50 years worth of culture and direction for that business. You know, it's an ocean liner really. So to start to move that is fairly daunting. So yeah, I am definitely seeing a change, and I'm not always seeing the change in the right direction. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. I'm seeing some, and I think this is completely natural, some kind of broken attempts, some half-hearted attempts, some kind of, well, we might, you know, we're just going to wrap this all up into a lovely, shiny marketing strategy. But that's the start of the curve for some people, you know, so they're going to have to adapt, you know, and get with the program. And you mentioned Mark Carney, and I think that was a major, absolute game changer, you know, certainly for the finance sector. Yeah, it had ripple effects, obviously, but when someone like that comes out and says it, then, you know, that's a bit different to David Attenborough for a lot of businesses.
Yeah, and I think certainly what I'm experiencing and seeing, certainly with clients, but looking at the wider sort of reporting on concepts like this, you know, broader sustainability issues, you know, certainly leadership and culture in businesses, you know, that kind of more holistic kind of view of the economy kind of right now, is it feels like it's a really interesting sort of conversational balance between the kind of higher level sort of influences, if you like, sort of political organizations, governments across the world, certain NGOs who focus in this kind of area, and then down at a local level, at the grassroots level, the business who then needs to implement it. I mean, you certainly have a voice and a perspective on that kind of wider thing, don't you? I mean, how is this kind of sort of collaboration and sort of co-creation of change, do you think, going to be taking place? Because it can't just happen in isolation, can it?
No, absolutely not. And I think those businesses who are isolated, it's the same with any risk. It's the same with the risk of COVID-19. You know, the more isolated you are, the more higher risk you are to any shock, any economic shock. And, you know, like it or not, we're facing, you know, a slower bounce back than maybe we thought, and we're facing a potential recession. And again, I think I'm of the you know, of the belief that out of these crises has to come opportunity. You know, necessity is the mother of invention. So if you're going to rebuild your business, then why not rebuild it in a more resilient and sustainable way? The problem being is that I think when you're in crisis, you often think about the panic mode of just re-establishing your business, just getting back on track. And I get that. And it's almost like that's not the right time for you to be having any blue sky thinking, reflection. You know, you're just thinking about how you're going to pay the wages. Completely understand that. But all businesses are at different points, and you know, they're all run by humans. And those humans who are up at night worrying about their businesses at the moment, a proportion of those, and a more significant proportion of those, are starting to value time with their family, value nature more, think, what was I doing commuting in the car every day? You know, what is my supply chain all about? Do I even know how my, you know, workers are eating in India? You know, this is what's happening with the fashion industry at the moment. And so I think that conscience thing has had time to kind of really hit home, more so than ever. Because if you think about, our lives are just so busy usually. And even though we're busy at the moment, we've just been, you know, sideswiped by this. And that creates a different environment for people to suddenly reflect in and say, what am I doing? You know? So I'm personally, although that's pretty horrific for a lot of people, I'm really excited about that, because I think the bounce back for me will be the number of companies that say, actually, we're going to be much more socially aware. Actually, we are going to look at CSR. What is it all about? We are going to look at sustainability. And actually, we didn't fly for like half of last year. So maybe we could go net zero. You know, maybe we could look at our carbon. So I think the doors are really going to open. So, you know, out of the darkness comes light.
Yeah, and I love that really positive spin, because I think certainly from my experience is that there's been, and one of my colleagues uses the phrase echo chamber quite a lot. In other words, you know, when you talk to people who clearly have a vested interest in something like circular economy, and or you're talking to people who are already on the journey, you know, everybody's very, very supportive. And so my colleague often says, yeah, but that's like an echo chamber. So you're just preaching to the already converted.
Yeah, there's a lot of backslipping.
How are you going to kind of sort of move this thing on? Where's the impetus coming from? I mean, you obviously experience these echo chambers a lot.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
Break out of that.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And it's something that the sector, I think, needs to get over and almost stop doing. I know why it's happening, because for years the sector was not quite demonized, but it was the poor cousin, you know, and so therefore you tend to stick together and you find like-minded people and you think like I think, and oh, isn't it brilliant? And I get that. But I think those days are gone now. The sector is not, it's not devalued as it was, you know, it's on a level footing. So I think there's a degree of having to kind of go, okay, guys, now we know they're in the same gang. But the work just to go back to the work I do, the work I love doing is actually working with companies who are just starting on this journey. And I mean, I grew up in a family engineering firm, and for years my dad, you know, just didn't get why I wanted to do environmental stuff, didn't get it. You know, we still have very healthy debates about it. And so I worked in London for a long time, and I used to do health and safety and environment in those days. And lots of people wanted health and safety advice. No one wanted environment advice. But you know, you used to talk to them about it. And so I've had all that feedback of like, oh, it's just rubbish. Oh, it's just, you know, we don't need that. Da, da, da. You know, but when you find a business like that maybe, you know, later down the line goes, oh, actually, yeah, I'm really into my recycling now, and I'm going to bring it into work. You don't go, oh, I told you so. You go, you know, those are the people that I want to work with, is the transformer people. And actually, I sometimes say it's a bit like the anti-smoker thing. Once you give up smoking, you become the kind of, you know, the most passionate anti-smoker in the world. And sometimes you find that with sustainability, that the strangest situations where businesses you think aren't engaged at all will become the biggest converts. And they have such power in their business communities. You know, they might make widgets, you know, but suddenly they're getting behind You know, maybe they'll sponsor a local award, or they're, you know, sending their staff on training or whatever. So it comes from surprising places. And I think that's a sign of real growth and success for me in the sector. It's not about the waste industry anymore. It's not about eco design anymore. It's about, and you know, you could go back to Mark Carney. When it becomes about the finance sector, you kind of, you know, you're getting somewhere then. So yeah, for me, you know, I talk about mainstream. So I have this series on Twitter and LinkedIn every day, not every day, everyday circular business models. So it's a series of kind of business models, circular business models that are all around us, kind of hidden in plain sight. So, you know, things like Apple, my Apple Mac is a reconditioned Apple. I bought it off exactly the same website as a normal Mac would be bought by any person. And then things like Ecover, I mentioned Refill, but even like Rug Doctor was one of the first ones I did. Well, they've been around for ages. So you go to a supermarket and you can hire a carpet cleaner. So why do people think circular business models are so unusual? Yeah, so that's what I want to do, is to try and make things more mainstream.
You talk about something that you describe as the sweet spot, and I think your words were, and I'm going to read these because it's something it's important to get this right, because I think with the sweet spot, we've got to find that sweet spot. So you talk about you love finding the sweet spot that offers both a commercial benefit for the business and a social and environmental gain. So there's a really interesting sort of balance there between commercial gain, competitive advantage, as you've just said, they're telling a really great story, and also then something that's good for planet and environment.
Yeah, I mean, we used to talk about win-wins in the 90s, and now we're, yeah, win-win-wins, really. Because when you look at a consumption model, in my mind, there is loads of negative connotations, I think, to making something, however sparkly and lovely it is, and it having a limited life and ending up on a beach in Indonesia or something. I just can't see the positive brand value around that. And I know this is something massive, you know, lots of big corporates are trying to tackle. You know, if you're doing something that involves repair, reuse, the very nature of it is that your customers have to come back to you. And customer loyalty, for me, is the holy grail for most businesses. You know, it's much cheaper to keep a customer than it is to find a new one. And yet the disposable consumption model is all about new product, new customer, new product, new customer. It's a really expensive way to do business. Whereas if you have 100 customers and they all come back to you every month, you know, on a subscription model or a pay-as-you-use model, that's a huge win for that business, you know. So the thing that I think they find difficult is you're going from a unit sales, you know, measuring your business in unit sales, to measuring your business in, you know, in monthly revenue, or a different way of measuring your, you know, your success. And it isn't it, it's a real shame that almost an, you know, an accountancy trick or term or habit is actually preventing people from getting their head around this. So people say, you know, it's a leap of faith and it's niche and it's all the rest of it. But as I said, by the time I've got through 100 examples, I hope people are going to stop saying that. Because if Rug Doctor can do it and Ecover can do it, then there is a market. And people used to think that market was small, but I think some of the recent press around people's attitudes, particularly during the COVID pandemic, is changing. And I think if you give people the option of a more sustainable alternative, particularly if you can get the price point right, and I accept there are challenges to that, then they'll take it. You know, and why wouldn't you want to be part of that that market? So the win-win for me, well, there's actually millions of wins, to be honest. It's not even a win-win-win. I can sit down usually with a business and find at least 5 wins, because the staff will get behind it. They'll get repeat customers. They may cut costs. They may have a more secure supply chain. They may open up new markets. You know, there's 5. I know they're all may, but you can sit and look at those. Whereas if you carry on business as usual, you have one shot, and that's it. You might develop a new product, a different color, but you still got to find someone to buy it. But if you're going to look at circular opportunities around your product, even things like a service wrap, all right? So say you sell electronics, why wouldn't you want to sell a repairable electronic item that's going to come back to you so you can resell it again? Okay, so there's a lot, there's stuff to get your head around, but maybe I make it sound like it's too easy, but I can't see why there aren't, why the wins are really obvious to me. I think there's just the effort that's required to change an very embedded mindset, which is the challenge, I suppose.
And it sounds a lot of the time then in particularly, as you say, well-established businesses, that a lot of the challenges come from the kind of embedded sort of seat of power, which for lots of organizations is the finance director or the finance team, because they hold the purse strings, they hold the bank accounts, they drive strategically a lot of the focus. And if the organization is very financially focused, rather than it being all about innovation, market growth, etc., then if the balance of power is there, then there's always going to be that barrier, isn't there? So on the other side of this current situation, where obviously we're seeing a lot of people waking up to the opportunity here, do you see a lot of the convincing that's going to need to take effect? And I'm kind of seeing this really from a business person's perspective. If there's any kind of angle that they're going to need to begin convincing the rest of the business, is it going to come from a financial perspective, do you think?
Yes and no. It would depend what sector you're in, I think, as to where the pressure comes from. Clearly, if you're in plastics, then you know about pressure at the moment. But even with all that pressure on plastics, the plastics industry still maintains, a growth pattern. Plastic water delivered in plastic bottles is on a huge growth curve, purely because of the developing markets around the world that they haven't yet exploited. So in that respect, financially, there's no reason why they would look at a more circular solution, because they have markets to exploit, and that's the classic model. So it's almost like they would be cutting off their nose to spite their face, right? To please the so-called Western world with all its appetite for sustainability, why would they stop feeding markets which are more than happy to buy water in plastic bottles? So you get these arguments where they say, oh, the consumer's not asking for it. Well, of course, because all around the world, people have different views. So there's that. And I think in those sectors where there is still growth to be had. Now, other sectors, I would see they are coming up close to a point where that growth is going to get more and more difficult. So fashion, the fashion industry is in real dire straits. And I think their models are going to have to change more quickly. So I think it comes back to really the market you're in. And I also think there's just massive opportunity, in all markets. There's a gap in most markets for sustainable products. So yeah, lots of different conversations at different levels, really. And what's interesting is you really need to have, someone from marketing, someone from finance, someone from procurement in the same room, because you'll get a very different perspective. And that's often the challenge, because as a sustainability professional, you usually get to talk to one person. They might be quality, they might be operations. But the minute they go back into the boardroom, they'll get sort of into loggerheads with someone from supply chain who says, well, that's all very well, Dave, but I can't even buy organic cotton. Where do you think we're going to get that from? And then the idea bombs. So it's almost like from the beginning, you need to get those people in a room, and the mindset needs to be changed for more than one person. It's very difficult. People often say, oh, you need the CEO or whoever. That's fine, because they have the power to tell people to change. But I think where you see real success is where actually the whole senior management team are on board. And this is now the direction of the company. It's not just a great idea that a sustainability manager came up with. So yeah, that mindset change has to be quite broad. Otherwise you will just you'll just hit the inevitable, can't be done. Or it can be done, but it's going to cost you. And that slows down the progress, doesn't it?
So if you can imagine a typical, I know there is really no such thing, but let's just talk hypothetically here. If you can imagine a typical management team. So they all meet up, multidiscipline, as you say. You've got marketing there, you've got logistics, production, finance, customer support, service, whatever. So they're all there kind of beginning this journey. And let's just say for a moment they don't have a sustainability manager. So so it's not, they're not that far into the journey of kind of really devoting resource. Where would a typical conversation, what kind of topics would start their journey? Where would they most usefully begin talking about this?
Well, interestingly, if you ask them, again, it depends on their sector, but more often than not, they're responding to customer complaint. So, you know, quite a lot of the retailers I work with are responding to complaints about ocean plastics. Now, the irony being the retailer has probably the least control over, you know, the plastics that it sells. Because if you took plastic out of a supermarket, you know, the shelves would be pretty empty. So it can do token things, you know, we've seen plastic-free aisles and other things, but you have all sorts of complications, you know, and huge costs. And the retailer, as we all know, work on tiny margins and volume. So they don't have that leverage over the brands. So, but they are still getting the complaints, and very vocally, you know, and people unwrapping their packaging at the tills and all that sort of stuff. And that, although that is only a small percentage of people, it's hugely vocal, and it really does hit customer services and the marketing teams. But I don't think that's the most useful place to start. And so I've worked with a retailer on this, and they were, you know, they said, we need a plastic strategy. You know, great, yeah, you do, but you need to work out really where your impact is. And you know, we did something that we termed a materiality assessment, but it's basically looking at, you know, where your impact is and where you can have most impact. So if you think about one of these matrices where you have kind of impact in terms of, you know, is it disposable? Is it going to end up on the beach? Is it made of some toxic thing or whatever? And then actually the things that you have most control over, and you have these kind of 4 segments. It's the things in the top right that you really want to attack. So A, it's got high impact, and B, you can do something about it. But if you just look at the things that, you know, you sell a lot of, it will be things like cigarettes or sweets. You know, you sell a lot of volume of those. Or they might be the highest. We looked at the sales patterns for a retailer, and you know, the most revenue they make is from the forecourt, from petrol. So, you know, you're like, well, that's my biggest kind of cost center or income center, but I can't do anything about plastic. The things that you can do about the plastic are actually quite small, you know, cotton buds. You know, they're such a small income relative to things like, as I said, on the go sweets or, you know, bars of chocolate or whatever. But they don't have any control over what Mars wrap their chocolate in, or Nestle, or whatever. They, you know, as an individual retailer, they can go back and say, we'd really like you to change the packaging, but, you know, global company like Mars. So we then had to look at actually where they could make a difference. And actually where they could make a difference in terms of taking plastic out of the supply chain, potentially therefore the environment, was on internal plastics. So things like cage wrap that goes around cages, the buckets that flowers come in, coffee cups in all their cafes, sachets, that sort of thing. And when they added all that up, and they thought, yes, we have direct control over this, they were able to make some really significant inroads in terms of taking tonnage of plastic out. And I think that's where the difference is. And I know it sounds like sort of passing the buck, saying, well, we can't affect these changes, we don't have the power. But they don't. So it's kind of like, you know, you have to look at where you can make the difference. And then, of course, you move on to the next things in the kind of like slightly harder pile. And you go, right, now we've done all the good, easy stuff. And we've told customers why we're doing it. That's the other really important thing. So they did a customer campaign, piece of marketing around it to say, we're going to do more community litter activity, and we're going to up the number of bins to stop some of this, the litter from these high sale items, crisps, sweets, cigarettes, which are litter items, you know, but they're not the items that are ending up in the sea in Indonesia. So it's really interesting to think about it. You know, the customer reaction, and actually the power that you have as a business. It depends where you are in the supply chain. You know, people say, well, why do they have to wrap that in that, you know, cucumber in that plastic? That's the classic, isn't it? Well, there's a really obvious reason. You know, there's really most things that are in plastic for a reason. And there's loads of them that are rubbish, you know, that shouldn't be there. I get that. But particularly with food, the supply chain has evolved in such a way to meet so-called customer demand. If you want a cucumber in December, then you're going to need it to be wrapped in plastic. Otherwise, it's going to be mush by the time it gets to you, or it will last 2 days. Certain times of the year, in season, if you buy locally, great, that cucumber will be fine, doesn't need to be wrapped. But you try getting strawberries halfway around the world without putting them in plastic, and you know them not being bruised, and them actually making it to you. So yeah, it's a chicken and egg, because we've got to this position where we want everything on demand, we want everything yesterday, we want everything shiny, perfect. We, you know, apparently won't buy imperfect fruit, produce, but we don't want it in plastic. So very difficult for businesses to respond to that. And that's why it's taken so long. And now people are starting to say, well, why is it taking so long? Because it's very complex. And then you layer in carbon and it gets even more exciting.
So the things I picked up, I think there's two really pertinent points that you've made there. Is the one thing is that whoever's shouting loudest isn't necessarily your priority.
Good.
And also really focusing on where you have some kind of influence in the whole kind of value supply chain that you're involved in, because you can have huge hopes about solving and changing something, but actually if it's outside of your sphere of influence, you're going to find that it's a really upward battle and you won't build the momentum. And then it becomes too tough to do. So everyone then shies away from it and goes back to business as usual. So for me, it's those two little things working in harmony, isn't it? Listening, but also being really, really practical.
Yeah, you have to do your bit. You know, that's the classic thing. You can't do someone else's bit, but you can lobby them and you can say, you know, you're part of my supply chain. And I think one of my big frustrations about ocean plastic and the whole furore about it, and it's, you know, I'm glad it's happened, you know, it's a global disgrace, is that lots of these campaigns are all about taking plastic out of the environment. But so few of those campaigns actually look at solving the problem, which is waste infrastructure in lots of these countries. And you know, that's one of the things that disappoints me about the way the plastic movement is moving at the moment. So, you know, there are charities. There's a charity called Waste Aid, fabulous charity, who do work on the ground to actually help, you know, some of these communities that are dealing with waste. And it's not just in Asia. You know, the waste situation in Africa is, you know, abysmal. And we do see the odd documentary, don't we, about e-waste and pollution and that sort of thing. It's a classic out of sight, out of mind. But going back to your original point about respect, we've offloaded that problem. And I sometimes say that the person who invented the black bin bag has a lot to answer for, because as soon as we put waste in a black bin bag, it's out of sight, out of mind. If we had to deal with that waste in the UK, it'd be a very different matter. If you had to deal with your own waste, you know, as we did before World War II, most people, you know, a lot of people had a bonfire at the end of the garden, or they fed it to the pig, or they, you know, dug it into the ground and all these sorts of things. But as soon as waste became a global issue, and again, I understand why it did, it's a commodity, same as anything else, we somehow lost track of it. And yet with all the auditing power in the world, we thought it was somehow okay to send it somewhere and not audit it. And I can't, that is one thing I cannot get my head around, because we have laws in place, we have a duty of care to ensure that our waste is treated properly. And yet, you know, so that's my one frustration, I suppose, is I wish some of the bigger corporates would get behind, and some of them are, to be fair, you know, get behind this waste infrastructure. It's boring, it's expensive, but socially, it's massive. You know, it's massive for the people that work in these plants. It's massive for the people that work in the local community. So there's a huge focus on things like taking nets out of the ocean and cleaning up beaches and all that sort of stuff. But I don't see enough focus on waste infrastructure. And I just wish a bit more, because I think that my exact point, it's we can't do anything about it. It's not us. But actually, they've got leverage. If you're somebody who is providing that, inputting into that waste stream, you've got leverage. But it's really in the too hard pile for a lot of people. So yeah, I suppose that's one of the failures we've yet to tackle.
So somebody listening or watching this is now thinking, you know, now's the time. I can see there's commercial leverage that we can get from this. We know it's kind of the right thing to do. We can see the competitors aren't doing it. Our customers are starting to ask for this. I think Emma needs to be the person we contact first to get some guidance and advice, and what kind of business who I think she'd be interested in working with. How could somebody inquire or make contact with you?
I'm always happy and had to talk to people almost every day. So, you know, through the Resource Futures website, there's a little bit on there about what we do. And interestingly, we haven't talked much about Resource Futures today, but interestingly, one of the things that I really love about Resource Futures is we work direct with communities, direct with businesses, and direct with the waste sector. So we have a far greater insight into what happens to your product than most people. And I'm not just, you know, that's just the way our consultancy is set up, as a heritage in waste. So in terms of, you know, sometimes we work with plastic packaging companies and they'll say, oh, you know, people have complained that our packaging is not recyclable. Why is that? We were told it's recyclable. We can tell them why, you know, what will happen to that package when it ends up at a recycling site, and why it's probably going to be discarded and why technically it's not recyclable. Or maybe to understand the policy that's coming around that's going to affect what they make that packaging out of. So the information about that is on our website. I'm also on Twitter at Emma Burlow, and I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. And yeah, pretty much on social media every day, so people can always find me there. And I'm quite happy to give people, you know, feedback or some time just to chat things through before. People are obviously quite often wary about consultants because they see it as a, you know, big investment, but I think that initial conversation can be really quite revealing without having to go into any big detail about anything. I think what I would encourage people to do is to look at consultants, and this is how I prefer to work, more as a sounding board, and to use them more like they would use any advisor, really, finance advisor or their tax advisor or whoever, rather than thinking, well, I haven't got a project and I don't know what that project is, so therefore I don't want to get a consultant. So some of the best relationships I have with clients are ones where they will literally ring me up and say, I've read this in the press, should we be worried? What should we do? Because then you can sort of help put it in perspective. And like you say, sometimes it's not the loudest things that you have to worry about.
This has been really fascinating. And I thoroughly enjoyed listening to, your insights, wisdom and experience. And yeah, it's really kind of made me start to think about the tie up between, the whole circular economy thing and the whole kind of marketing area as well, and sort of customer insights and kind of what we can do about it. So there's a whole bunch of things going on.
Exciting times. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, really good. So thank you so much for your time today. Really
You're very
appreciate
welcome.
it. And yes, good luck with all your various ventures.
Well, likewise, and thanks for inviting me on.